Guys, welcome back to the channel. If you haven't been here before, my name's Andrew Stevens. I'm a realtor in Halifax and a co-owner of a brokerage here in Dartmouth. And today I have a special guest, Eric Johnson, manager of client services with the Halifax Bridge Shelter. And we're going to have an open conversation about the Halifax housing crisis. So thank you, Eric, for doing this. I really appreciate your time, and I love the conversation we had the other day leading into this. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Bridge Shelter and what you do and what your kind of everyday looks like?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here to talk about something I know a bit about, which is, working with people who are homeless and experiencing housing insecurity. And and the Bridge Shelter, which is the former Doubletree in Dartmouth, and it's a 190 bed shelter. So we've got about 190 people there right now, and it's all people who are experiencing homelessness and a lot of other kind of issues that may be going on while they're experiencing homelessness. And so we're trying to support those people as best we can and keep them safe, keep them out of the elements, really out of the winter, and try to provide some support, ongoing support to them to move them forward in their whatever their goals may be, which is usually housing, but kind of anything else that they want to work on. And so as a manager there, I just support our wonderful staff, honestly, to just do that work with folks. And so that's a brief kind of synopsis of what I do.
Awesome. And in terms of like a 190 bed shelter, so how many workers are involved in that? How is it funded? And to me, that sounds like the biggest shelter I can think of around. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it's the biggest one in the province. There's it's about we got over 100 staff, honestly, through all the different roles, whether that's client support workers, whether that's housing support workers, whether that's team leads, or there's a bunch of other people that work there that I'm forgetting right now. But yeah, we got a bunch of people that work there, and our job is just to kind of do what needs to be done to get people moving forward. So it's a big operation. It's all funded by community services, and what they did is community services rented out the hotel from the owner and contracted out the operation side of it to Adsum and Welcome Housing. So two different organizations that are working together to historically for decades, 20 or 30 years each of them. They've historically supported people who are experiencing homelessness, so it made sense for them to work together on this. And so that's when I got into the picture to help run the whole operation. And so it's like I said, it's funded by community services and just run by us nonprofits.
Awesome. And that was just extended for another year or so, right? They just announced that the other day?
Yeah, it's just year to year. It seems like we got 1 year, and now just as it's coming up on the new fiscal, they extend us for another year, and we anticipate to be extended for a few more, I hope, because we're doing some really great work there. And another thing that I should have mentioned is that it's the first of its kind of like a joint partnership between Department of Community Services, which is the main funder, but also Department of Health, Nova Scotia Health Authority, has provided a lot of funding and a few staff positions to really support people there, because as anybody who's worked in the field of homelessness and housing, the people that face homelessness have a lot of health concerns and a lot of mental health concerns. And so in other shelters I've worked in, there hasn't been that same cooperation, I guess, between health and community services. And so it's really good to see the powers that be recognize the need of people who live outside, people who live in poverty, honestly, have a lot of things going on that, yes, you can say, okay, go to this hospital for this problem, go to this office to see this person. And a lot of times it just doesn't work. People are, if you're living in a tent, you're not going to be able to make those appointments. You're not going to be able to go find a doctor. You're not going to be able to do all those things. And so we bring people inside into the shelter, and then also try to offer those extra supports for folks, whether that's, we have a social worker to get people connected to mental health and addictions, or we have the VON nurses to be able to do some basic kind of nursing services for folks. And we have occupational therapists, we have continuing care folks, and CCAs working there too. So it's a whole bunch of different other allied health professions, I guess, that work in tandem with us to support folks. And so it's a really busy place, but it's really cool to see all the stuff that we were able to do for folks that previously and in every other place I worked, we haven't been able to offer. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I know based on just like the quick meeting we had earlier this week, and I went down there and checked it out. That was my first time being in there. And it seems like just the level of organization and stuff to me seems different from what I would expect, I guess. And I'm curious, like something that was all over the news lately was the shelter that was put in at the Forum. and it seemed like there was, some issues there, and some people didn't want to go there, and they would rather be in tents than in the shelter. And I think a lot of like the general public doesn't really understand like why that would be the case or how that would happen. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think? To me, it sounds like what sets you guys apart is all of the collaboration and all the different services you're providing under one roof. Is that why you think that your shelter has been kind of successful, if you will? And, what do you think went wrong, I guess, with like the Halifax Forum shelter?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. Like, I don't know if the forum there's anything wrong with the forum. Some people, I think we just all need to remember that people who experience homelessness are just like the rest of us, and they want, they have rights and freedoms that everybody has. And one of those rights is, you can't force people to go to places they don't want to go to. And so some people, I've worked in many different shelters, lots of them in congregate settings, and some people really thrive in that environment when there's lots of people around and it helps with their mental health. And some people really don't do well in those settings. And so I think that's one of the things that sets us apart as a former hotel, is that people have their own bathroom and their own door to close, so that just giving people that sense of privacy and just like letting them be. So if they're really stressed out and like, they're going to yell at staff or something, or they're going to yell and start a fight with their neighbor, in other shelters, there's no spaces for them to go to be like alone. But here, people can just shut their door, and we're like, hey, let's just leave them alone for half an hour and just let them chill out, let the staff chill out, let everybody else. And then, we can talk about it later if it was serious enough that we need to address it. But if not, we can just let them go and we don't have to do anything about it. And that has been the main thing that sets it apart for us, is that giving people their own space and their own privacy, which, most people want, is really helpful. So there's a handful of people that I think is our biggest success in the shelter, is that they've been, homeless for many, many years. And they've been kicked out of many other shelters. They've had apartments, but they've had to lose them because, they didn't get the right supports or anything like that. Whereas they come into us after being outside for a while, and just having that, not having to interact with your neighbors, not having to interact with staff more than, once in a while, can be really good for them, because they just need to be left alone, and they might not live, in a way that a lot of other people would think is a great way for them to live, but it's their choice, and they can have that freedom, and they can do really well. And so we've been able to keep a number of people inside that a lot of folks, you'd be like, oh, there's no way they'd last longer than like a week in a shelter. And they've been with us for, 6 or 8 months now. And it's one of those really good success stories, I guess, that we have, is having those people that you wouldn't expect would be able to maintain like independent living are living with us for a while now. And you know what, they might be able to live in an apartment, but even if they did get an apartment and got evicted, at least we were able to support them for a while before then. And if, it's just working out really well for some folks, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding an apartment is another whole aspect of that. So let's touch on like how many years have you worked in this field, and what have you seen in terms of like the housing crisis as a whole in Halifax, and how that's kind of progressed and how that's changed, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, especially where it's really been a lot more prevalent, I guess, within the news.
Yeah, I started doing this work back in 2011. And back then it was a lot, as we all know, 13, 14 years ago, it was a lot easier to find apartments. Housing was a lot cheaper. And even when I started doing housing work back then, you could usually find an apartment for somebody. It wouldn't be maybe the ideal location or the ideal size, or maybe not the nicest building, but at least you could find an apartment, and at least landlords were willing to kind of give people a shot, give people a chance at their own place to live. And sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't, but you could always, there's usually a spot farther out in the suburbs or something like that we could find a spot for. But now all those places, there was just a story in the news recently about how Spryfield has lost a lot of its like affordable housing through the private market. And every city, every neighborhood's the same way. Fairview's the same way. I used to know half the people in Fairview, and now it seems like I go to Fairview and I don't know anybody there, because it's all moderately priced, I guess, rich, maybe a little bit above averagely priced apartments, where it used to be $600, $700 apartments all over the place in Fairview. And same thing Dartmouth North, same thing with a lot of different neighborhoods. There's just no affordable housing in any of these neighborhoods anymore, as it seems. So that's the biggest change that I've seen is just that lack of any kind of private market affordable housing. And they've been bought up by a lot of different landlords, and people have been rent evicted. And in some cases it's like great, because a lot of the places that these landlords have been buying up and kicking people out of, they were not very great apartments to begin with, but it's also, there's people that live there, and it's nice to see them improving buildings, I guess, but not at the expense of somebody's place to live. And so that's why ultimately, I think we see such an increase in homelessness is because as these apartments get more and more expensive and landlords get a little bit more picky about who they're going to take because they have, 50 people applying for one unit, that it just means the people on the lowest end of that income scale, the people who are on income assistance or people who are working very like low wage jobs can't afford it. And so they just end up on the streets. And we talked about that the other day of just like, 10, 15 years ago, the people who were living outside and the people who were homeless for a long time were usually people that not only could they, not afford an apartment or not have a job or anything like that, they also really struggled with their mental health, or they really struggled with their physical health, or they had some kind of drug addiction or alcohol addiction or something like that. And now we still have that many people, and there's probably more folks like that, but we also have this whole new cohort of people who are simply priced out of the market. There was people I've worked with that have worked, all summer long. They're doing landscaping. They're making $20 an hour, and they just got home from work and they just go to sleep in a tent, and then they get up at 4 a.m. the next day and do it all over again all summer long. It's just like, you guys are doing everything right. Like I don't have any experience working with people like you who are just like really, just like my dad or something like that. And it's just like, I don't know how to make affordable apartments. You don't need any support. Like I just give you a $1,000 a month apartment, you could afford it and you'd be fine. But those apartments don't exist anymore. And so it's a really tricky part of the problem now is just the numbers are so big of just people that don't have a lot of other things going on. They just really can't afford it. And I don't know what the solution for that is other than just building more and more low-income apartments, because the private market is not going to be able to provide enough for those folks.
Yeah, I think like a really common misconception, I think, from the general public about homelessness and the housing crisis situation is, well, why don't they just get a job? Or like, why don't they just stop doing drugs or whatever that might be? And, sure, there's some people that are going to have mental illness issues, or, struggle with mental illness. They're going to have drug addiction or whatever it may be. But like you said, a lot of the people now that are, living rough or, facing homelessness or on the brink of that are working individuals. They work jobs, they work, 40 hours a week, they have a car, they, get to work and back, they're responsible, they're reliable. A lot of them that I've seen in the news and on social media and stuff too, that are having issues finding places, it's not like their budget's $800 a month. Like some of them, their budgets are like $1,500 or $1,600 and they still can't find a place to live. And it's interesting because my father, for example, owns like an almost 60 unit building down in Bridgewater, and half of his building is on income assistance with the town of Bridgewater. And every time a unit comes up, we're talking 50 applications like right away. So that's a huge part of the problem is this new world of affordability is not so affordable, right? Like now an apartment at $1,600 a month would be considered affordable. Well, I bought my first home about 6 or 7 years ago. I never once paid over like $1,100 for rent, and I lived in pretty nice spots that would now be, rented for like $2,300 or $2,400. So, a big question I think a lot of people have is, what do you see coming? Do you think this is going to get better anytime in the, somewhat near future? And do you have any ideas of, some initiatives that could be taken either by, private lending or government kind of lending as well to, push this further in the right direction and to try to, get us out of what we're in right now, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of things there to talk about. The one thing that we always kind of talk about in my work is the definition of affordable. And I think CMHC defines affordable as 80% of the average market rent for that area, which, could be if everything is $2,400, then affordable is $2,100, which is, I guess, cheaper than $2,400, but still not affordable for me. I couldn't afford that. And so I like to think of affordable in terms of like rent geared to income and how much people are making. And I think the main one for that is like public housing. So public housing is just 30% of your income, and anything like that is funded totally by the government, because a lot of I know people who know these things, economists and stuff, say you shouldn't be spending more than 30% or 1/3 of your income on housing. And so that's why we have those rent geared to income units for folks, because that is really the only way you can actually, afford housing and be able to pay for everything else if you're anywhere near like the low income end of the spectrum. So, being mindful of what we define as affordable is the first thing. And then, I think I'm a big proponent of the government building as much affordable, or even like both definitions of affordable housing is possible, because people who are working still can't afford $2,400 a month. So we do need as much incentives to build anything like that as we can, because if not, I just see it as, like look at Fairview or Spryfield now, where it's the working professionals, sometimes even not making minimum wage, making much more than minimum wage, are just competing with people who are making minimum wage and people on income assistance. And so that doesn't help anybody when you're having those competitions, because most of the time it'll go to the people making more money, because the landlords will see those as as a tenant who's more likely to pay the rent on time. And I guess the part of your question about what do we do is, just goes back to building as much as possible. I think the province announced 220 odd units of public housing that they're going to build, which is great, because it is the first time they've done that since I think the 90s. And I'm glad that they're doing that. We just need that every year or so, because if not, we're going to have to open up a new bridge shelter every year with 190 beds for people who are experiencing homelessness, because the problem is just getting worse and worse as we see the price of housing getting worse and worse, or getting more and more. If we don't do something about building more housing for folks, I think it's just going to get worse before it gets any better. And, I really like my job, but it's really expensive to run a homeless shelter. And I can't help but think of the millions of dollars that they're spending on renting a big hotel and paying all the staff who, do great work and deserve every cent that they get for pay. It's much cheaper. And lots of studies have shown it's much cheaper to just give people apartments and put them in apartments, and then put supports in them, like wraparound supports around them after they get into housing, rather than just providing these Band-Aid shelters and transitional housing and stuff that's going to be around for a couple of years, because, those things, it's just rent. We're not going to have that housing forever. And 5 years from now, when somebody else buys the building or we have to move out, it's not like a long-term sustainable solution. So I think the key there is we just need to build housing, or I'd love to see for every dollar we spend on a Band-Aid solution, like homeless shelters and temporary and evicting people from encampments and parks and stuff like that, we should also put $1 towards some big pot that buys affordable housing, because right now we're not building nearly enough affordable housing for the amount of people who are not only like visibly homeless and people that are in shelters and people in parks, but also the people that we don't know that are, staying on somebody's couch or crashing 3 people to a room because they can't afford to move in on their own. And those are the people we don't have any idea of who they are, how many people they are, but I bet you the number of people who are invisibly homeless is multiple times the amount of people that are, the known homeless people. There's probably, I think the Affordable Housing Association says there's around 1,100 people or so experiencing homelessness right now in Halifax, but I bet you the true number of that, if you include people that are couch surfing, it's thousands and thousands of people that need housing just as much. So we just need to build lots.
I would agree with that. So I'm pretty sure it was the first time since 1993. So it would have been like 30 years that when they announced it. I think it was late last year they announced it. 222 new units. That's across the province, not just HRM too, right? So I think what you said is likely very accurate. Like, okay, so if there's visibly 1,000 homeless people, give or take, in HRM, let's just call it that for the sake of this conversation. Like you said, how many more are couch surfing and things like that, which you could put it under that same category, basically. And then on top of that, I think a really scary number to know, and to be honest, I don't even know if I'd want to know it, would be how many people are teetering right on that edge and barely making their payments and barely staying afloat in their place that they're living now. And maybe they're, in an apartment that's on the rent cap, and if they get evicted, then they're basically screwed for all intents and purposes, right? Yeah. So I'm curious what you think about the rent cap in general, because obviously it's a very positive thing for a lot of people, and I would never deny that at all. But something that I feel like is somewhat of a negative aspect of it is the premise that, because this was put in place like retroactively, and now there's a lot of these bigger buildings that are kind of stuck at these like lower rents because a developer or a landlord or whatever left them low for a long period of time. Maybe they were just, being good landlords and not cranking the rent up on people and whatever. In a sense, that almost to me creates a negative aspect of it, because I feel like now, because of the rent cap, landlords and developers they want people to leave because they want like they don't want those $800 rents in their building, right? So as soon as they leave, not only are you getting rid of an affordable unit, but you're also pulling a tenant out of an affordable unit, and the premise of them getting back into one is like near to impossible, right? So I'm assuming that's like a big challenge that you face in general. And I'm curious, I guess, A, what's your thought about the rent cap and you know that balance there of the good versus the bad? And then also just, you know, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in your like general everyday in terms of trying to get people into housing? And is it really only subsidized housing that is possible for you to get people into, or is there any on the private sector as well?
Uh, there's a lot of things there. So I'll just talk to the first one about the rent cap. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a economist or like a scholar on housing policy, but I do, know that without the rent cap, a lot of people would just get the rent would just get. And I know before we had the rent cap, there's a bunch of people that were, if the landlord just didn't like them, they would just see like a $400 a month rent increase, and they would just essentially be evicted because there's no way they can go from paying $700 to $1,100 or $1,000 to $1,400 because that's just way out of their budget. So on the face of it, I think the rent cap needs to stay because people just can't afford to have these massive increases. And I understand landlords have these pressures, and it really comes back to, I guess, like the financialization of housing. Like, yes, we need people to, people need a place to live is what it comes down to. And we see so often nowadays, people buying and selling properties as a way to like make money and to take care of themselves. Which, people have the right to make money. People have the right to do that, but it comes on top of the potential of evicting people and seeing people out on the streets. And that's the side that I see all the time is like, yes, you have a right to make money. And I think there is probably some middle ground there where you can raise the rent a certain amount of money to cover your expenses. But you can't be raising rents $500 or $600. I remember a couple of years ago, one of the advocacy groups for, I think it's IPONs, was like, hey, to send out a letter to all the members saying like, listen, you guys are kind of rocking the boat a lot with raising rents too much. Like, yes, we don't want to raise rents so much that it becomes a public outcry, because if you're going to raise, double people's rent or raise the rent by 50%, it creates a really bad look for landlords that you guys are just fitting into the stereotype of like greedy people who just want a dollar no matter how good or bad of a landlord they are, because there are really good landlords out there. And kind of into your second question is the only kind of success that we have in private markets is really like understanding and compassionate landlords who are willing to work with us and willing to kind of be patient and understanding that people who are, women who are fleeing domestic violence that we work with a lot, or people who've been living on the streets might have a little bit of baggage, I guess, a couple of things that go with them. And if you just be patient with them, a lot of times after a couple of months, things will kind of level out and things will calm down. But only a small handful of landlords are that patient. We really appreciate those ones because for the most part, the folks that we move out of the bridge, for instance, most of them are going into public housing and housing run by nonprofits. So yeah, anything like that. And very, very rarely do we have a private landlord that is willing to take some of our folks. But like I said, the systems have changed. Landlords' expenses are going up, so I can see why. I don't think they need to raise the rents as much as they have been, but because I also pay bills and I don't see my power bill or electricity going up 50% every year. But I understand somewhat, but it's just not the answer because as the market has shown us, it's not for those bottom 5% of income groups. The market can't house those people really.
Yeah, and I mean, shout out to the good landlords out there because they're few and far between at this point. And I get like the hate toward like the big bad landlord. This is something I talk about a lot, like in my YouTube videos and just with other agents and clients and whatever. And it's a tough one because the reality is, as a landlord, and I am one, full disclosure, but at the same time, I'm not getting what I could be for my properties. They're certainly not like affordable units, but they're fully renovated and whatever. But, at the end of the day, you don't want to be going backwards as a landlord. But at the same time, most of these landlords have seen, incredible growth in their property over the last few years and stuff like that. So, I think when the province extended the rent cap and pushed it from 2% to 5%, I feel like that was the right move at that point because I feel like they had to do something. But let's face it, the can is kicked so far down the road now with the rent cap that if they take it off, it's a train wreck, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think they can, and I don't think they will anytime soon. I'm a believer that there's a happy medium in there
Yeah.
somewhere. I have no idea what it is. It's very easy to sit here and pick out the problems.
Yeah.
I don't have a solution, and thankfully it's not my job to have that solution. But, at the end of the day, I think there's a happy medium there. Maybe it's tied to, the average rental increase year over year. Maybe it's tied to inflation. Maybe it's tied to, how much NSP is jacking their rents or their rates or whatever that might be. But, the reality is if people think that rent cap is coming off in 2025, I think is when it's scheduled to right now, or at the end of 2024, maybe, I would be shocked if that happens, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And really, I don't necessarily think it should come off. And a lot of people might not like that I said that, but that's the truth of it, right? So I guess with that, we talked a little about what the government's been doing lately, and they've been making a lot of announcements lately. They did the 222 new public housing units. They're doing the tiny home builds out in Sackville. But at the same time, the different levels of government seem to be, not on the same page, because while the provincial government is doing things to give, nonprofits like you guys more money and to put money towards builds and all that, at the same time, then you have the municipality kicking people out of some of these designated areas that have been designated for quite some time. And now it's just like all of a sudden, well, they can't be there anymore. I'm curious, do you think the government's doing enough? And if not, what more do you think they should be doing, and how, to what level do you think the government should be involved in that? Because I think a lot of people feel like the government should stay out of it altogether. But I think it's been proven after they stayed out of it for 30 years on the public housing side that, well, here we are. So obviously that wasn't necessarily the right way to go about it.
Yeah. Well, the government is definitely doing more this last year or so than it has in the past however many years I've been working here. There's lots of money for homelessness, and I think, that's a testament to just how bad homelessness is getting across the whole province. And Halifax used to be the center of it all, where I think a lot of politicians thought, okay, homelessness is only a Halifax problem, so we don't need to pay attention to it if we're in the Valley or if we're up in Cape Breton. But now I think from what I hear from folks in, Truro and the Valley and up in Sydney, is that it's everywhere. Every kind of small town has people popping up in tents, it seems like, and they're opening new shelters all the time in different towns that probably, if they ever had homelessness in the past, it was like, oh yeah, that's just Eric's brother-in-law who's just crashing in somebody's garage for a few weeks until they get a spot, and everybody kind of knew somebody. But now I think homelessness is all over the province, which is a horrible tragedy, but it does mean that there's more of a provincial knowledge of it and acknowledgement that we need to do more as a province. That is not just an urban downtown Halifax thing, that it's everywhere. The same thing in the suburbs, and we see it out in Sackville. There's a new shelter in Sackville and all these pallet communities, and for a while there in Sackville, there's only like a few people camping down by the river that ever knew about. We could keep an eye on them, but now, from what I hear out in Sackville, there's dozens and dozens of people out there, and it's such a in-your-face problem now that the province can't ignore it. So the province is doing a lot more than I think it's ever done ever since I've started working in this field. It's finally acknowledging it's a problem and doing what they can. Sometimes I think they're giving a response to homelessness, like opening up more shelters, which is what we would have done 20 years ago, but it's better than nothing. I wish instead of, like I said before, instead of more and more shelters, we'd be opening more and more apartment buildings and stuff like that. And same thing with the pallet shelters. It's great that we're giving people these pallet tiny homes or whatever they are, but if we would have started building an apartment building with 40 units in it a couple of years ago, we could have an apartment building instead of these tiny shelters for folks. So they're a bit late to the game, but at least they're doing something. And it's never enough. I don't think you're ever going to satisfy me that we're building enough public housing or affordable housing for folks, but at least 200 units is better than nothing. So it's the step in the right direction. It's just not enough. And then we have the city who just does their own thing. I think the city gets a lot of pressure from these encampments downtown, and it's, the people living in the encampments in Grand Parade and Victoria Park were really struggling, and I'm glad that we were able to help some of those folks. But at the same time, it's like the city has decided that these people are the most in need. We don't care about anybody else. It's like we're going to devote so much time and resources to clearing these parks out so we can get these folks out of there, which, A, it's not a very humane way just to kind of kick people out of parks. But B, who's to say that? I always worry about that. Like, say now we gave a hotel room to one of these people in the parks, but what if there's somebody in like, what if there's somebody trying to flee an abusive relationship that now we don't have that same resource to offer that person, who I think a lot of people would argue that person fleeing an abusive relationship is more in need of those than people that were living in a tent. And yeah, it's dangerous and it's not great, but I think on the balance of it, there's other people that we might want to prioritize ahead of those people. But because it was such an urgent issue for the city to get these people out of the parks, it really took away from that. And that's something that I really struggle with the city is just focused on this one issue at the cost of focusing on anything else, it seemed like, which really frustrates me.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that stems from public outcry. I'm guessing it stems from the businesses in the area having issue with it, and to me, the truth of it is, if the city put as much effort or the province put as much effort into keeping people from getting to that place in the first place, then maybe we wouldn't have the problems that we have and the amount of parks that we have. And I can tell you that I grew up in Lower Sackville, and there was a period of time where I wasn't out there a lot. I used to work out in Sackville a lot, and it just kind of, it ebbs and flows, right? And I wasn't out there for like a few months at a time, not at least in like the area of the Cobblewood ball field and Boston Pizza down by the Downs View. And when I was out there for the first time in months, I was like blown away. I was like, I can't believe what I'm seeing, right? And I think that's another common misconception of the housing issues that we have, is that it's just like, well, nobody can afford to live in downtown Halifax. Well, when I look at some of the rents posted in Sackville, for example, let's use Sackville as an example. It's a great one. It's 25 minutes from downtown, whatever. The rents are only like $100 less. So it's not just a downtown Halifax problem, and it's not just an HRM problem. In fact, a lot of the smaller, kind of more rural communities, like I know in Truro and Bridgewater, places like that, they're really hurting for the number of housing units. So, a stat that blew my mind when I heard it late last year is that right now, and you might know this number better than me, so I'll be curious to see what you say, but the last number I saw was somewhere around 20,000 units is where we're believed to have like the shortfall, and that's only in HRM, I believe. And then in terms of the province, we're adding 7.7 people to the province every year for every 1 unit of housing that we're building. We're only building about 4,000 or 4,500 housing units a year across the whole province, but we're adding, 30,000 people to the province. So, again, not to put too much of a negative connotation on it, but you don't have to be an astronaut to do the math on that and realize that, in my opinion, this issue is not going anywhere anytime soon. And I feel like a lot of times when I hear just people having general conversations about this, it sounds like, they're almost like alluding to the fact that like, oh, well, when things get better on the housing front, or when things get cheaper, or, when the housing crisis gets better. And to me, I don't even think that we're necessarily in the housing crisis yet of where this is likely to go. And I think that when we look back on, the year of 2023, let's say in 10 years from now, or 15 or 20 years from now, I feel like it'll be almost laughable that we thought we were in the housing crisis then, because I feel like it's just going down a path of almost like a path of no return, realistically.
I mean, I really hope not. I like to think that there's some light ahead. But I also don't know some of those things. I don't have the expertise to answer. I do remember seeing like a 20,000 number for people in an HRM that were paying, I think, more than 50% of their income on housing. And I think that's a huge thing too, is like, there's a lot of people that are, in an apartment or something like that, but if the rent cap comes off, or if they lose their job or something like that, there's a lot of people that are paying way too much of their income on housing that they could become homeless or become evicted really, really quickly if they can't afford their next rent or mortgage payment. So that's something to definitely be mindful of. And with the amount of people coming in and the amount of housing units we're building is, I don't know the answer to that either. These are a bit outside of my purview, other than I work in housing and homelessness in general. But when I think about the number of units coming available, I really think we just need to devote all of our money just to building some boring old apartment buildings every place we could, because every time that one of the old schools get sold off to private developers or something like that, I just hope that we're building hopefully somewhere we can build some affordable housing. And it's sad that we can't build it on, Bloomfield School or something like that, where it's just sitting vacant right now. And I really wish we would just build affordable housing, even 80% of the market value housing, just build anything there, because all these people coming in, a lot of them are going to be well-off people, can afford places, but a lot of them are going to be just like the people that are building our housing. I'm sure we're bringing in construction workers and people to start building these things, but where are they going to live if we're going to build all these housing? So it's a pretty complicated problem to solve, and I don't know what the answer is, other than hopefully we can build our way out of it. But that's a economist question that I'm probably not capable of answering.
I mean, it's a good point, because, you look at, okay, well, what are the main issues that we're facing here, right? And one of them is, the cost of materials, the cost of land, that's all skyrocketed, the cost of labor, the lack of labor. And, I hear a lot of people saying, well, we should just bring in a bunch of laborers from out of the country or out of the province. Well, that's all well and good, but guess what? If we bring in 10,000 people that are going to be laborers and they're going to work and build these buildings, well, they got to live somewhere too.
Yeah.
So it's this vicious cycle, and I think that a lot of people underestimate how complex of an issue it is that we have here. And, I agree with you. I think the only way is to build our way out of it. However, in a sense, the indicators of like how much housing has to be built, it's almost like an impossible goal. And that's not just for Nova Scotia, it's for all of Canada, realistically, right? When you look at what's needed across the country, not just our province. But I mean, I like to hope there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's nice to see the province doing more. And it seems like every month they're announcing something new that, even if it's 30 units, it's 30 units that we didn't have before, right? And I guess my big worry is by the time these 222 units are built, by that time, we're probably going to need another, like really it should be 1,000, and it probably should be more like 2,000 or 3,000. And by the time they're built, it should be more like 5,000. So, that's kind of the problem is the spinning of the wheels, and the trying to catch up now is so difficult. And it's easy to point blame and point fingers, but at the end of the day, we're here now and this is where we are. So it's nice to see them trying to do something to get us out of it. Right?
Yeah. And I keep on thinking behind us is the NSCC in Dartmouth, and they put up those student housing for NSCC students really quickly, which I think is great for those folks. And I just want that to be replicated for like every sector, for like, there's going to be housing built for healthcare workers, I think down in South Shore I read about. And, I work for, two nonprofits are my bosses technically, and both of them have a long history of managing supportive and affordable housing for folks. So why can't we just build those apartment buildings and just give them to nonprofits? And put it in their thing that they're never gonna profit from it, because that's not part of what we do, and just like let us run them, because there's a lot of people that are willing to kind of operate these buildings, and as long as the funding is in place to kind of support and put the supports in place, then nonprofits have a long history of doing that. And that's just one way that I think we just need to just do that for everything, and just build as much as we can, and let everybody do all these things, because it's not going to be solved any other way, I don't think.
Yeah, and it begs the question, there's a lot of provincially owned land, municipal owned land, begs the question, why doesn't the province get an architect to design a building, a very baseline building? It doesn't have to be anything special, standard building, and, put as many units on it as humanly possible. Something similar to what you guys have going on at the Bridge Shelter would be a great kind of idea, something along those lines. And, put it out to tender and get a big developer to build it, and put, baseline finishes in it to keep it as affordable as possible. And like you said, get guys like you to run it, and nonprofits like yours to run it. It begs the question for sure, because I agree with you that what we're thinking about now, that NSCC building, it did go up pretty quick.
Which it was funny, because in my one of my previous jobs, I worked with a number of students who were homeless, and they come to us looking for help as a housing support worker, and you just feel bad for them, because like there's no, I think NSCC at the time didn't have any units for their folks, and their like answer was just to like look on message boards and post on Marketplace and stuff like that. And so I'm glad that they're building it, because there's a need there. There's probably way more homeless students than anybody wants to acknowledge. And, that's the beauty of the right to housing, is everybody needs housing. Everybody has a story of when they're in college and they would eat ramen and all that, and couch surf for a while. And a lot of people have done that, but that doesn't make it right. People in universities still need a place to live just as much as everybody else. So we need to be building housing for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And look, there's a lot of the apartments going up, as you know, are, considered luxury type apartments, if you will. And I think there's a market for that. I'm not saying that those things shouldn't be built, but I also don't think that every single apartment building needs to be of that scope. And when I think about, I live in Halifax, kind of near the Commons, and there's a ton of buildings going up around me. Well, guess what? All those rents are going to be a lot of money because, the cost of land, the cost of building, they're probably into it for a very big number per unit at the end of the day. So they really have there's a reason the rents are $2,500 for a 1-bedroom apartment in these new buildings. And, is there a market for that? Sure. But there's a lot bigger of a market for the affordable housing. And that's what we need more than anything, right? And while these, great big buildings going up with these high-end units are good in a sense because it's opening the door for, somebody to move up to that, and then that opens up that apartment that they came from. But then the problem is the rent cap is gone. So if they were paying $1,600 a month and it could be 22, well, when they leave and upsize or, go to a nicer, more luxurious type of apartment, then that rent at their old apartment is basically going to be the rent that they were already paying anyway, because the rent cap's off and the developer or the landlord's going to jack the rent.
Yeah.
Not every time, but generally speaking. So it's not opening up that door as much as, we would hope it would. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm with you. We need to build out of it is really the only way, and we need to do it very, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So Eric, look, I really appreciate your time and I appreciate you being here. I know you're incredibly busy and the work you do is incredible and very important. And I'm curious if you have kind of some success stories or some cases that you're proud of that you can share with us to leave us on a good note after a, relatively in-depth conversation about a topic that's not exactly, all smiles and rainbows at the end of it.
Yeah, well, one of the success stories that keeps getting thrown around by the funders is the number of 50 or 60 folks that we were able to transition from living in the bridge to moving on independently. But most of those people that we moved out, they were moved into seniors housing, and it's subsidized housing, and so it's affordable, which is great. And it's also really great that they can go from being homeless to signing a lease and having their own space that they can do whatever they want to and have their own friends over and make their own rules for it. And that's great, not to diminish their success, but a lot of those people, they didn't need not all of them, but a lot of them were pretty kind of easygoing, chill folks. They're mostly just priced out of the market. And so it's great to be able to support those folks. But the thing, and I'm really proud of our team for being able to support those people into doing that. But the thing that I'm most proud of is the folks that I think a lot of people, if you spend time in Halifax or Dartmouth, they're the folks that you would see panhandling a lot, or might be visibly in mental distress or visibly kind of using drugs. And a lot of those people have been homeless for a long, long time. And we've been really successful in bringing a handful of folks like that into the shelter and supporting them as best we can so that they've go from being on the streets and being outside for many years to being inside with us now for 6, 7, 8 months. And there's not a really good way to quantify that other than just if you work in the industry, a handful of folks that we don't know what to do for, but we're able to kind of keep them inside at least for the winter so far and hopefully for a bit longer. And that's the kind of success that I'm most, proud of and happy with for us. So that's one success.
Yeah. And I mean, based on, look, it would be ideal if we didn't need any shelters in the city. That's the ideal. And I feel like if we're talking about shelters in the city, your guys' situation is one of the better ones, the way it's set up, like you said, with their own private rooms and private bathrooms and so on. And it's great to think that, because based on what you told me the other day, it's you guys take on a lot of cases that, might be seen as the more difficult cases or the people that need more support, but you guys have a lot of support at your shelter. So, it's great work. And I love hearing even just a little bit of success stories in this world, mean a lot to a lot of people and their friends and their family and everything. Right. So it's great work that you do and we need a lot more of it. And I hope to keep, opening all Nova Scotia and the news pages and so on, and seeing more and more announcements that you guys are getting, more funding, more beds, and hopefully it, turns the corner and more public housing built and everything. And hopefully that, brings us somewhat to a light at the end of the tunnel at the end of the year and at the end of, the decade and so on and so forth.
Yeah, me too. I hope so.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed chatting with you about this and I really appreciate your time. Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.